in Module 1, we talked about the introduction to the concepts of archetypes. We really focused in on that and
Right.
their significance in the personal development. And now we're going to go more into that and also talk about like where they were formed and how they influence personal behaviors, emotions, and life patterns. Um, so the concept of archetypes started with Carl Jung, and he's a physician, a Swedish physician. He worked with Freud at the time, and he was like a protege of Freud, and they kind of diversified their development of their own programs um, into two different groups. So they separated at some point, but a lot of the same concepts that Jung had were associated with interactions with Freud. So like the a subconscious aspect, the importance of dreams, especially, was Sigmund Freud. He was really focused on that. He has a book, on dreams. So he kind of brought that back. Before we really kind of just forgot about dreams, and I think that really kind of set the stage for Jung to be interested in archetypes because archetypes express themselves a lot in our dreams and in the structure of dreams. Um, a question that people often ask is like, well, what happened to Jung in Western society? Why we're so focused on Freud? Well, Freud was very popular in the West because of his nephew actually being a
Right.
marketer and bringing his stuff to the West and promoting it. Freud at the time was actually poor and I think dying of
Oh.
cancer. So he had throat
Oh.
cancer, yeah. And his nephew is actually the one who kind of created his fame in America. And Jung really never took off in America. It's primarily more interested in like European stuff. So
Sure.
the UK and stuff like that, they still don't really like. They're not huge into Jung, but they're a lot more than they were in Freud, and they know of
Sure.
like Jung. Um,
Makes sense.
and people say his name differently too, just so you know.
Oh.
But they say like Young or something. Anyways, but so archetypes is kind of a Jungian thing, and it's becoming more popular in cultures today. A lot of
Sure.
people have talked about like shadow work and things like that, and
Hmm.
shadow's one of those archetypes that people explore. And so Jung was very into kind of like the paranormal, and he started exploring like how um, these unseen forces kind of influence our reality,
Right.
and it all kind of started taking off with Jung when he got a book, a translated book from a friend um, about Chinese philosophy, essentially called the Golden Flower. And in that book, they talk about like the feminine and the masculine kind of archetypal forces, and Jung took that as kind of like he created the concept of like the anima and animus out of that, and
Right.
so those are like the foundational kind of archetypes in a human being, and neurologically you could associate that to like the left and the right brain, and so like this duality effect in humans. And but Jung took it a step further in applying that not only do you have a personal unconscious that is influenced by these unseen forces. Essentially, if it's unconscious, you can't reach it, you can't touch it. So what you have is a conscious self, right?
Right.
And you're aware of the things that happen to you in that realm. But then there's this unconscious. Freud talked about the subconscious. Jung talked about the unconscious because he didn't like the idea of like a lowering the unconscious down by that term. It kind of seems
Right.
demeaning.
No, that makes sense. I see it that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, like occultists and stuff like that, they don't use unconscious because they do see the sub conscious as like being um, uh, it takes in stuff. It's not and there's like hierarchy of consciousness, and the subconscious would be the consciousness that takes in. So it is sub level of the personal consciousness and the super
Sure.
consciousness,
Oh,
but
sure.
um, it doesn't demean it as Jung thought, because
Right.
he did read a lot of like metaphysical type works and stuff like that, and
Right.
he was kind of not into that. He aware of it, clearly aware of it, in like alchemy and stuff like that, but he wasn't a huge promoter of like occultism or anything like that. He thought it
Sure.
was kind of
Oh, that
woo
makes
woo.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Gotcha.
he was trying to create science, in
Right.
that sense. He kind of had to separate himself. But later in life, we realize, I think even 2016, the Red Book was published, which was his like kind of personal journal, almost
Right.
Bible. And in there, I think it opened the public into seeing a little deeper meaning or deeper aspect of Jung, and we saw that he was a little bit more um, uh, far out than we suspected earlier. So that's kind of
I
cool.
think, well, he had to get his material across to society.
Yeah.
And there's always that underlined, should I, what do I reveal about myself to society with material? Because we know, like, you've got the Christian sect, you've got your different people, your different religion sects. So it's how they look at that. And if he was presenting more in the metaphysical alchemy realm, some of that would not have ever gotten out there because people would have rejected it right then and there.
Yeah.
So I'm sure he had to actually save face and keep it more scientific, because that science would have been accepted more.
Right.
And so, and that may have been why it took even longer to get to the Western world of acceptance, because it's very Christian. It's a different way of thinking. And so if it's not Christian thinking, Christian therapy, Christian counseling, things like that, at one point in time, it was seen as New Age. It was seen as, not Christian. And so that was a big push to keep that material away. We're now more relaxed in our therapies. We understand, even in the Christian world, that there is more out there than just what idea that we have been presented with. And so I think people are more accepting to look into things more like Jung and these concepts of meditations and how to utilize those things, because we're seeing the value in that along with everything else. So I really think that may have been why he was a little bit more rigid how he presented his material out there. And then I think the Red Book did. It opened up a lot of more understanding. It made him more relatable instead of just this mystery person who has this different way of philosophizing and theorizing things. So
Yep.
I think that may have what we're looking at. And
Yeah.
so we now get to play with his concepts and help get some of that information out.
Yeah. 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 Older history is very interesting in the psychological world.
Yes.
It was very rigid. Like you were
Very
saying.
blocked. I
Yeah.
think we had a lot of blocked thinking. They didn't want the material to come through because they were afraid.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
were
That's a good
afraid
point.
it would change their mind. They were afraid it would change their doctrine. And I mean, I really think they were such traditionalists, such hard traditionalists, that they didn't want, and that's why the whole progressive thing is very hard for some people, still older people, because they don't understand we have to have that progressive aspect to everything, because everything's always changing, everything is always moving, it's a constant flow.
Mm-hmm.
As you get older, it's harder to adapt to that change, just because people are staying older longer, and
Yeah.
I think it's really hard for them to adjust to society. I see that in my own parents.
Yeah.
Like there's just things they don't want to learn. They don't want it to be affected, and we need to find a way to help I think that transition, I think people will age easier. I think if they have more control over how they process, how they intake stuff, how things get to them, I think that relieves some of the anxiety that we see in people. And
Definitely.
because I just think we're to that state, there's just too much out there, and people can't intake it all. And with technology, especially, I mean, we're overloaded. We're our
Hmm.
senses are just they're maxed out.
Yeah.
And that's why this program is good, because it's going to help people in meditation to stop the chaos, to stop and be able to figure out and center within themselves how to promote a positive change without the chaos that comes along with it at times.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely opening, and that helps a lot of people kind of get more information, right? So they can see a
Yes.
bigger picture. So yeah, um, so archetypes. So Jung kind of he created this concept of archetypes and this collective unconscious part that human beings have, and that the archetypes reside in the unconscious of an individual as well as the collective unconscious of like society and the world and things like that.
Right.
And these forces express themselves through people and culture as patterns, and they shift and mold how you behave, right? So if you're the caretaker, like you've expressed that a few times, um, you are driven to provide people and support for people, and that's kind of who you are. And
Right.
so we could say that an archetypal unconscious energy expresses itself through you as the physical action of taking care of people and being interested in being part of that
Yep.
pattern. So in the collective unconscious, though, so like humans have their own unconscious, but then there's this collective ness of all people, right? And so Jung kind of, you could say, went into like almost a metaphysical aspect of reality by saying, oh well, everybody's actually connected in a way. You could say it's through culture and society of this unconscious same pattern, right? These patterns are large, they're infinitely large essentially, and they
Right.
express themselves by changing society and pushing it in certain directions based on whatever pattern is being expressed.
Right.
Um, a lot of people focus on the shadow when it comes to Jungian work, and the shadow is like we could we could associate that with even the amygdala, right? The limiting factor of how we see reality, how we express ourselves in others, or ourselves as a reflection um, in others. So we see the bad and the negative things in other people when those things are inside of ourselves, right? And that's limiting us to seeing a larger picture of who those people really are, who we really are, and working with that. So in QART, we're trying to kind of bypass that and get into the more expansive collective unconscious part, where all the more some of the other archetypes reside. Um, so we'd like to go in the next part and start talking about recognizing your own dominant archetypes. And we kind of brought up for you, Karen, the caretaker. But what are some other archetypes that expressed in your life? I know you talked about DMT World was a social network that you manage and are one of the creators of, and you talked about how an archetype expresses itself in you with that as well. So, what is Can you tell me more about that and what that's about?
Oh, when I take on any sort of project, it can be work, it can be anything that I'm working on. I usually find I'm a person that gets things done, and so that's when this leadership part of me comes out. because I've learned that other people don't always have that aspect or that energy in them. And so I'm kind of one that just takes on and goes. When I started with this, with DMT World I'm at, when I got into it, I sat back and just kind of didn't know what I was to be doing. I just wanted, I was going to be help creating. So at that point in time, I was in a creative mode. I was a creator. I just, helped build up the clients, or the people that are in there in the community. And through that, I became into this leader mode where I took the initiative and just took care of things, explained things to people. But it kind of melded with the caretaker, because I was always helping and providing information, providing the stuff that they are needing. We're 4 years into doing this business, and now it's to the point where I don't have to be that role anymore. I don't have to be the leader anymore, because like I said, we have people that are coming up that are taking the initiative, are finding that archetype within themselves, and I can see it. And so I want to aid and help get them to be even more in that archetypal type. So I'm segueing into a mentorship, being the mentor, where I'm just kind of sitting back and guiding. I've thought about it yesterday, and I was thinking about, how I'm going to go segue other people, because I have other things I'm working on. So my attention has to shift. And the only way for my attention to shift is if I make it shift. And that's putting myself in a different position. And so how I do that is I encourage other people to step up and align with that energy of a leadership. And so those are the things that with the archetypes at this point in time, those are the things that are most prevalent. My caretaker is there because that is, I think, my dominant archetype. But like I said, I'm exploring how to switch from the leader that I've always been able to connect with. Like, that's an easy energy. I just can step into that one. Mentorship is just a little bit easier because I have to sit on my hands. I have to keep my mouth shut, and I have to guide and advise when it's appropriate and not overstep some of the things that I'm trying to get them to do. And so those are what the archetypes I'm at this point in time dealing with. So I can segue into whatever the next thing that's coming at me, because I can feel it. Like, I can sense it, I can see it. So I know I have to shift and I have to change some of these other things that are going on.
That's great. Yeah. It sounds like you did a lot of the module 2 work already, so that's great.
I did.
Yeah, you're deep into it already. So
it's great. It's fun because it explores things in me that I know are there, that I briefly think about, but now it's making me stop and really think about. And one of the things that I've learned about going through this module 2, specifically in the workbook, is you can't rush through it. You have to really digest the material. You really have to read each lesson, and you really have to take time. You have to provide the time to sit down and really think about it, digest it, review it, integrate it, and figure out how you're going to apply it. And once you get through that first lesson completely, moving on, but you got to make sure you reflect so it reminds you of what you're doing throughout that workbook. So that's what I've been doing. I've been spending a lot of time in the material for module 2, because this is where the connecting, I've already connected with that energy archetype, so I know what that is. This is where the exploration of where are they prevalent? When do they come up? What I also had a revelation the other day is what is so important about this course is, I think as we're going in society and things are happening in our world, we're losing connection with archetypes. We're losing the connection of that energy. And because I really believe that energy, that archetypal energy is the makeup and the fabric. What we know as our social world, it's everywhere. It's in mythology, it's in theology, it's everywhere. It's in the tarot, it's in, you name it. You can see all how the archetypes have made up the material fabric of what we know of existence. And so we are losing energy contact with these archetypes, and it's changing us. It's changing us, and I don't think it's for the better. We've been casted in this weird spell that has got us all kind of the chaos. When I talk about the chaos, And so it's dampening. And I think that is what is cutting off some of the connections to these energies. And people are not able to connect with them like we did. We don't have the heroes. We don't even have the lovers anymore. We are changing the fabric of how the family components are.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're the heroines that we don't look at these. We're breaking these down. And as we break those down, we're breaking down our fabric of the existence of what we know in this world. And it's changing, and it's changing
Yeah.
fast. And so I think it's very important that we learn how to reconnect those energies with the archetypes so we can essentially, it's an ascension thing. It's to ascend, and we're raising our vibrations, we're raising the energies, and we know that's what has to do to keep the balance of where we're at and get to that higher understanding, or it's not going to. And then we're all going to be stuck down in this lower vibration, this lower level, and there's no telling what will happen to people.
Yeah.
And so that's also why I think this is a very important thing that we're doing with this program and helping people how to learn that.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's ascension energy that we're promoting to help get people to those next elevations that they need to get to.
Yeah. I mean, you bring up a lot of great points in there. One thing with archetypes that I can say is related to what you said is we talked about symbols a little bit last module too. So going back to that a little bit, so archetypes are unseen, untouchable, essentially, patterns, right?
Right.
And so these patterns act out in our lives, or act out in art and culture and things like that, and they take form into symbols. So how we touch and feel things, right, and how we interact with our senses. So you watch a movie and you see certain patterns of like the hero's journey in the theme, like Star Wars and things like that, and you relate to that because it has structure to it and it has a pattern. It connects to that emotional energy inside you that is archetypal, but it doesn't really represent the archetype completely. You can never, right. Jung said you can never really touch or encounter the archetype in face to face, right? So right. Anytime that you encounter it, it's symbolic of that. It's not the thing. It's packed into a little box of what we think
right.
the thing is.
It's right? Kind of like that thing in your peripheral that you know is there, but you can never see it.
Because right. Every time you see it, yeah, it's gone.
Right, when you try to look to see it, you can't see it. So that's how I interpret that. Yeah. What you just said, it's in that area, it's there. It's kind of, but you'll never be able to trap it to get it to do what you need to do unless you connect with it
right
this way.
And the other thing you said is about society kind of losing these connections. I would say they're losing awareness to the archetype, because the archetypes, of the Greek gods and things like that, right. They still exist as they did back then, but just not paying attention to them or not being aware of how they influence your life doesn't make them any less real. It just makes life more confusing. And right. if you're not really connecting to specific archetypal forces, you could say, then which ones are expressing themselves, in your society? So let's just say that you didn't really connect to the caretaker in your life, but you just kind of switched to whatever felt, whatever the need was at the time. Right. Well, that might be a little bipolar, and you're not having a structure in your life or anything like that, and nobody can make sense of who you're going to be or what you're going to be next, and it's a little bit chaotic, and I can see chaos being a big trend in our culture as we shift probably into like a more dominant archetype of something else as that takes form. But as society's not really aware, we're not educated on patterns of, and you don't even have to use the word archetype, you just say there are patterns of structure in society, and those patterns and structures are real in the sense that they have existed of all time, then and you deny that as saying there is no pattern or structure, then the only alternative is chaos. So and that's not entirely healthy, I don't think either. So a little chaos is fine, but creates art. But but a lot of chaos can lead to some pretty tricky
Detrimental
situations.
things,
Yeah.
yes. Mm-hmm.
So recognizing and understanding your dominant archetypes in your life clearly has been something on your mind, and we teach in QART some techniques to do that. And one of them is self-reflection. You clearly performed the self-reflection in this last module already. So, you spend some time thinking about what is the dominant things in my life, the patterns of my life, and how are they expressing themselves, and putting a word on it, like the caregiver or the leader and things like that is really useful, because that's a symbol that you can connect to it and you can relate to it. And you're like, well, maybe I don't want to be this person forever,
Right. Mm-hmm.
or I want to be more well-rounded. So I want to focus on the attributes of the leader. And you're like, okay, I want to be a leader now. So how do I work with that? So you're
Right.
doing that. You're journaling, taking notes and things like that about your life. And one thing we want to make it clear is that we want well-rounded people, so people that aren't hyper-focused on one archetype.
Right.
Clearly, one's going to be more dominant in your life as you come up to this point um, than others. And looking at my own archetypes, I went through a series of them and was looking at them and was like, well, that one relates to me, and this one relates to me, but that one does not relate to me. And then I
Mm-hmm.
think, well, what is it in that one that I'm missing?
Right.
Something
Yeah.
that I'm not aware of, because you know these um, these patterns are you have them all. Even if you don't think you do. So
Right.
everything is inside you. So but we want to select a couple more. So when you go through module 2, think about the multitude of what you are, not just one dominant one. And it's clearly like important to think about what is dominant in your life and which ones are important,
Right.
but think about more than just the one. And that's useful later on when we start talking about using emotional energy created through the interaction of archetypes and identification
Right.
of archetypes
True.
to promote positive desires in our life, goal-changing desires. So, um, you know, and it's clearly going to shift day to day too. So, like some people have a lot of energy one day, and then the next day they don't have that energy. Um, and maybe a different archetype is playing out in that process of the change as you go through the day-to-day experience.
Yeah.
So also in module 2, we are exploring the idea of harnessing the archetype for strength. So you did that with thinking about your social network.
Mm-hmm.
You identified the archetype that you were really interested in, and then you consciously applied it to the task at hand. How can I use these patterns? How can I associate
Right.
with this
Mm-hmm.
knowledge to express that, play the role of that archetype in this situation? So that's really great. Um, and using it for decision making. So, if you have a task at hand and you need to make a decision, well, how would this archetype, play out in this decision
Right.
and act it out? Um, and you mentioned that you were into to theater and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
and so you
Yes.
in plays and things, you clearly act out different
Yes.
structured patterns of people.
Oh,
And
absolutely. That's the best. That's one of the most nice. That's one of the things I like the most, is being able to connect with the character that I'm portraying in a play. And to do it on live theater is the best, because you have that moment to be able to call upon that character, that being, that energy. And it is, you step into it. That's why this is really fun to go through, because it's the same type of concept. Once you can, the symbol, once you can get into finding that archetype that you want to utilize, you do. It's learning how to doing it in an instant and how to focus it to the point where you gain that energy at that point in time. And it's just like theater, just like doing character work.
Yeah. And, it's one of the techniques that we want to apply to people is to use that imaginative visualization of role play with their archetype, and think about what they would look like, how that'd feel like. And in Module 3, we kind of walk people through a meditative guide on how to do that. So that will be something we'll talk about. The importance of understanding personal archetypes is important because it allows for that self-awareness too. So when people go through exploring the archetypes, they're getting this expansive awareness versus that narrowing awareness that we typically use in our day-to-day jobs. So QART is trying to expand the awareness, trying to get into the right brain and open it up to this expansive view of things. And that's going to change your life in multiple ways because it allows for you to access more of your mind. Essentially, we're connecting to different parts of your mind by thinking about archetypes. And when we actively engage with that and feel that emotional energy through that archetype, then and use it in our daily lives, we're connecting to that part of our mind that maybe hasn't been connected to before.
We're stimulating that aspect, so it's lighting up, it's working. And the more it works, the easier it is to attach to it and utilize it. Yes. Yes, my brain's all over the place lately with all of this.
Yeah, it might be a little troubling, a little hard at first.
It is. Like, what's really strange is like now, the synchronicities of things that are starting to happen. Like, you're seeing more of the things that relate to an archetype. I'm looking at symbols and going, oh, that clearly is, it's this type of thing. It's this type of energy, or it reminds me of this certain thing. And it's really fun because I'm a symbols and signs person anyways. I walk through my day from the time I get up to the time I go to bed. Everything around me, I'm looking at numbers. I'm calculating numbers for numerology. I'm seeing signs. I'm seeing symbols. I'm seeing how they correlate. The synchronicities of the same things lining up. It's just, it's fascinating. And it's really exciting because that's the way that I enjoy going through my days, is seeing the signs and symbols, because I know when they show up, I'm on the right path. So that's how I delegate that.
Yeah. I mean, when I first started working with this material, things just, you see reality in a different way. You see it symbolically a little bit more.
Yes, absolutely.
And then you see that it's more fluid than you thought it was before, and alive. So it speaks back to you in a way.
Absolutely. That's the best way to say it. It does speak back. It's constantly talking to you.
Yeah.
If you know how to see it and know how to read it and hear it, it's constantly talking. It's just figuring out what it is and how it is. That's why a lot of times I'll tell people things and it's just like, sometimes I'm like, did that even, you question yourself. Is that happening? Do I actually see it? Am I just bullshitting myself? That's why some of the things, like when I read tarot cards, I don't read my own tarot cards anymore because when I lay things out and I look at it, I'm just like, I know what my brain is thinking. So when I'm interpreting my own cards, it's like, am I interpreting because that's exactly what I want? Or am I actually seeing it for what it's actually telling me? And so I have somebody else read them for me because that way I can listen and take it in that way and can apply it instead of me reading it myself and going, are you lying to yourself? Are you legit? Yeah. Like, I question myself a lot on a lot of things that I do just because, I do that. I just don't know if it's, like I said, am I bullshitting myself or is it actual? So I need that other confirmation from somebody. So I have a magical person in my family and she does just fine. But I think that's important too, to connect with somebody else who actually has that same interest to bounce things off of, to validate things for you. Because when you're working in actually things of a magical sense, it's that there's that questioning, and so you do need the validation of other people to say, no, you're actually, that's what I'm seeing too. So
Yeah.
I think that's important.
Yeah, when you work with the archetypes, maybe you have an idea of who you are and what you're um, most directed towards, but maybe
Right.
somebody else, in your family or something like that, if you bring up some of these traits of what we're talking about with the archetypes, maybe they would see other things in you that you typically don't.
That
Maybe
I don't. Yeah,
maybe those are
absolutely.
the ones that you're not aware that you actually express.
Right, because they can see them. Sometimes we don't always see your own, what you're doing or how it correlates. So yeah, you're right. They can actually attribute and be like, hey, this is what this is. So that's a good idea.
Yeah. Um, I mean, it's clear that a lot of people uh, don't think they have a shadow, or they don't really think they have a shadow towards something. But essentially, if you don't like something, it's a reflection. So
Yeah.
even in schools that I've been in where they do a lot of shadow work, there's still a blindness towards the collective dislike of an object. So they have a blindness towards that, and so we're very long way of saying that we're very blind towards our shadows, and
Yes.
because it's a reflection of who we are, and that's difficult to really see
To look
sometimes.
at.
Yeah,
And yeah, the stomach. Yeah.
yeah, and
To want to believe that we are capable of. Yes. Yes. I
yeah.
understand.
So in court, we don't really deal with the shadow because it is so difficult to work with, and
Right.
so we're dealing with the more positive aspects of things to try to bypass the shadow, essentially.
Right. And we're also not looking at other things or people. We're looking
Right.
within ourselves
Yes.
to help amplify the positive, that energy to change. And so we don't have the need to touch the shadow, to talk with the shadow, to be a present of the shadow
Hmm.
because of that. We're not needing that to look at to go, what's wrong? What am I dealing with? We're going, where am I at and how do I improve that?
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense.
So to conclude this module, we have a workbook for you as well. The reading is a lot shorter than module one, thankfully, so it's not so overwhelming. But the module will help you identify your archetype and understanding and applying the concepts of archetypes in your personal development. So think if this video is a little confusing about how to work with archetypes, I think that guide will
Oh,
clarify it
it's
for you.
wonderful. Like I said, take the time to go through each lesson and really digest it and work with the components that it's asking to do, because it just makes it easier to one, flow through the workbook and to get it. Because if you sit down and you try to go through it in one setting, it's too much to work with in one fell swoop. You have to break it up a little bit. So it's an easier transition. So that's what I would say. Take
Great.
time with it.
Yeah, great.
Obviously,
Well,
I've said take a lot of time with it.
yeah, that's great. I'm really glad you're engaging with
It's fun. I
the
like it. I
material.
enjoy it. It's not something that I sit down and I'm like, ugh,
Yeah.
I have to do this. And when it's that type of thing, then you don't want anything to do with it. It's not like that. It's always eager. I'm eager to read it and see, because each time I go back through it, I get different
Hmm.
things. And so that's the nice thing. It's not the same thing over and over, because it can touch different aspects and bring up different energies and feelings every time you go through it. And that's
Yeah.
that's the beauty of that work, of what this material is. It's
Yeah.
always different. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, people that are already taking this can, I think in module one, they can clearly see that this is having. It should be clear that it's having some type of effect on them already. If
Oh,
not,
yeah.
then hopefully as time goes on, they'll see that this isn't just like a typical self-help book. This is actually helping yourself. So it's
Right. It's a
teaching you.
system. It's a system of help. Like
Yeah.
it stirs up thought. It
Hmm.
stirs up multiple things that go inside. Like I said, I'm walking around and all I'm seeing and I'm identifying what's archetypal throughout my world. I'm identifying the symbols. And that's what each time, I think, if you're right, if somebody sits down with it and keeps working with it, I think they'll get to that point too with it, and it will just flow, and it will be just something they are always constantly doing, because they now have we've put that program inside of them, and then now it can go and it can just work.
Right.
And that's how I see it.
Yeah. And one thing that I realize too is when I start seeing a broader picture of things, my goals start changing too. So later on, in a later module, we'll talk about goal setting. The reason that we talk about that later versus right away is we want to get some of this expansive thought process, this widening
Right.
of the mind, so that we can
Right.
see possibly that some of the goals that we had set at the beginning, that we had this idea that we wanted, aren't actually the things that we really wanted. That there's something that we're missing, that when we start utilizing more of our mind and the space in there, that we can actually start picking up on those actual desires that are kind of hidden, and start feeling them, touching them, and then start achieving the results. So
Right.
I look forward to seeing you in module 3 and seeing how that worked for you as well. So look forward to that, and we'll see you in the next video.